Hello, my name is Tim Smith with the Adams County Historical Society, and I want to welcome everybody to Monuments Monday Live. Okay, so I thought this would be kind of fun to do something inside here where I talk a little bit about monuments and I can use more illustrations and talk about some of the things that I've learned about monuments and talk a little bit about Gettysburg and its monuments. And probably like all of you in the audience, I have been coming here since I was a little kid. Here I am with my little brothers in deep thought on Little Round Top. I think they're sitting on top of like the Vincent carving rock, or the rock right beside it near the 44th New York. And, I think when I was young, one thing I learned right away is Gettysburg has more monuments than any other battlefield in the world. Now, how many monuments do we have? Monuments, markers, and tablets. It really depends upon how you count. And I have a list here that was provided to me by my good friend Fred Hawthorne, who's a battlefield guide and just loves to talk about the monuments. And he's actually, over the years, been the guide who has kept account of how many monuments are out there. Now, there's all kinds of variables. I mean, are we only talking about monuments that are at the Gettysburg National Military Park property? If we include monuments that aren't on the property, are we talking about all the monuments in the town? Are we talking about monuments that don't relate to the battle? Things like the plaque at the Eisenhower tree on the Emmitsburg Road, or the one down near the bowling alley on the Emmitsburg Road that marks the spot where a fireman was killed in an automobile accident. Or do we count the monuments that were placed by the War Department that are in other places besides Gettysburg, like the itinerary markers, like there's a marker in Fairfield or Cashtown, So Fred Hawthorne has come up with different lists of the kinds of monuments, and he has 1,781. Now, it's interesting, and again, it's monuments, markers, and tablets. How do we differentiate? I generally tell people a monument is dedicated, and a marker or a tablet is placed by the War Department or some other entity. So, and of course in that 1,781, we're talking about flank markers and advanced position markers also. But again, there's other interesting things I think that we should probably count as monuments that some we do. On Fred's list of 1,781, he does count 10 carvings. And of course, he tries to differentiate between what is a military carving, like in this case, Augustus Lucian Coble of the 1st North Carolina near Spangler Spring, and like graffiti that someone carved into the rocks at Devil's Den. So he's got 10 of them on his list. And then I also like to point out that there are monuments and markers that were once out there, but they're no longer there. And, I don't know, in my list, I come up with like, well, it depends on how you count again, maybe 100. Now, depends again what you're counting as a marker. When someone put a piece of wood on a tree that said General Reynolds fell here, is that a monument, marker, or tablet? In my count, it would be. So, I want to get Fred to add on his list all the monuments that we know of that used to be there that are not there anymore. And so I guess at a young age, I was very interested in all the monuments on the battlefield. And what I realized was you could study the monuments on the battlefield and learn about the battle. And you can't really do that in a lot of other battlefields, especially ones that don't have monuments. Obviously Antietam has monuments, for instance. But we have different kinds of monuments around the battlefield. And there are statuary monuments to individual people, like General Warren. Look at my General Warren postcard. You see the tower? You can see that's kind of dated, isn't it? But by and large, most of the monuments on the battlefield are over 100 years old. Most of the monuments on the battlefield were placed by the veterans who fought here themselves. And most of the monuments on the battlefield were placed by Northerners to commemorate the Northerners that fought in the battle. And most of the monuments are regimental monuments. So maybe not most. I guess if I had to count them up, maybe it's only less than half of the monuments, markers, and tablets. But so when you study these monuments and I give a tour of the battlefield, I try to make it easy for people to understand. So I like to tell them that every time you see a monument, there are 300 men right there. The men always stood the same way, 150 in the front line and 150 behind them. And so whenever you see a monument, there are 300 men. And that's basically the average size of a Northern infantry regiment at Gettysburg. And that's the bulk of the monuments you're going to see. So in that total, I know some people like to say 330. But they're adding, large cavalry units in and all the Southern units that don't have regimental monuments. So that's why I say 300. And for instance, the other thing I might talk about at some point in the tour is that every regiment had 1,000 men when it was organized. And, but they've been in battle and they've suffered losses in camp and disease. So the average size is 300 at Gettysburg. But the 44th New York Infantry, for instance, on Little Round Top, inside their monument, they have all the names of all the men that served in that unit during the war. So they have over 1,000 names inside the plaques. And just, so you know, a regiment is divided into 10 companies, generally. Sometimes, there's an extra company, but it's Company A, Company B, Company C, up through Company J. There was no I company because J's and I's look too much alike. So I'm sorry, I got that backwards, didn't I? There's no J company because J and I look too much alike. So H, I, and then usually K. So when you go around the battlefield, you can look at the monuments and you can read the monuments and see where the people are from. One other thing, the units that have monuments at Gettysburg, it's not like they have monuments at every battlefield they were involved in or every battle. Most of the time. Now, there are some exceptions. Some units have a monument at Gettysburg and a monument at Antietam. But most of the time, that's the only monument for that regiment anywhere in the United States. So the veterans came to Gettysburg to put up a monument, and it had a twofold purpose. The monument marks where that unit was positioned during the battle, but it also commemorates that group of 1,000 men during their entire 4 years of service. And so often, I shouldn't say too often, but you'll have a monument and it'll have things on the monument that reference other battles. Sometimes they put the names of the other battles they were in. Sometimes they'll put a relief or a scene from another battle on the monument. Like the 6th New York Cavalry on the first day's battlefield comes to mind. On it, it has their commander leading a charge at one of those obscure cavalry battles. I don't even remember what it's showing. And Frederick's, I was going to say the engineer monument has pontoon bridges at Fredericksburg on it, on a relief. So I think these things are interesting. So when a monument is dedicated, all the men that served in that unit come to Gettysburg to help dedicate the monument that are surviving. I just wanted to mention that, as far as monuments go, the cornerstone of the Soldiers' National Monument in our National Cemetery was placed in 1865, and it was a ceremony. And then it was completed in 1869. And, a lot of people consider that the first monument. The Minnesota urn in the National Cemetery was placed in 1867. So that also sometimes is considered the first monument. In 1878, a marker was placed to where Colonel Strong Vincent was mortally wounded on Little Round Top. And that was really the first monument erected on the battlefield outside of the National Cemetery. So that sometimes is called the first monument. You know what I get a kick out of when, you read one of these trivia books? What's the first monument placed on the battlefield? It depends on how you reference it, doesn't it? The first regimental monument placed on the battlefield was the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry in 1879 near Spangler Spring. And to me, this monument is important in the story of our Civil War battlefield monuments. Prior to this, almost all the Civil War monuments honored the dead. And, it's been a while since I talked about it, but I used to give a program on Civil War battlefield monuments altogether. And, whether we talk about there's a little marker to Bartrow, I think his name is, at First Bull Run that's placed during the war, or there's a monument at Stones River that's to honor the dead, or Second Bull Run had a marker early on to honor the dead, or the Soldiers' National Monument, or the spot where Colonel Strong Vincent fell, or the spot where Colonel Charles Frederick Taylor fell, or in the wheat field where Lieutenant Colonel Henry Merwin fell. All these early markers mark the site of someone's death or honor the dead. And this monument, it talks about the men that were killed in this unit at the battle, but it also honors the living, the survivors. And I think this was an important point in battlefield memory when the veterans are just starting to get older and they're reflecting upon their Civil War service. And not only are they honoring where comrades died, but they're honoring their participation in the event, and they have reunions, and they come back to the spot, and they talk about what happened, and they dedicate the monument, and we honor the survivors that were here. Now, this image, I believe, is from an 1880 stereo card, William Tipton, and it's William D. Holtzworth, the famous tour guide from Gettysburg, who was a Civil War veteran. But he is in front of the 2nd Massachusetts, and that monument is still on that rock. I think it's interesting. The top of this rock was cut off, and then the 27th Indiana monument was placed on. That is a horse back there too, I think. But there's the Tawney House, Charles Zephaniah Tawney. But this is just a fabulous photograph. These things that were there originally, these little I don't know what you would call them, just little decorations. They are no longer there. I've even looked in the woods for them. And these metal rods are no longer there, but the holes where these rods were connected to the rock, the holes are still there. So maybe put that on your list for homework. The holes in the rock for the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry. Good. Now, Massachusetts put up the first regimental monument marking the location, the 2nd Massachusetts. Also, in 1883, I believe it was, Massachusetts passed an act within the Massachusetts State Legislature appropriating funding to put up monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield for each of the units from that state that fought in the battle. And that was a first. And then in 1885, Massachusetts starts placing monuments around the battlefield. But in 1883, I think they passed that act. I think about this often. In the 1880s and 90s, Do you think you have any trouble introducing a bill into your state legislature providing money to put up monuments for veterans when every single member of the state legislature is a veteran? I mean, I don't think we can ever underestimate the power that the Civil War veterans had after the Civil War in Congress and in the state legislatures. So what they would do was a state would appropriate money, like in this case, Ohio, and then they would send representatives out to a site, and they would choose a site for their monument. And then they would form, the same committee probably took on bids for the monument and looked at designs for a monument. And then they put up the monument, and then at the same time, they're organizing a dedication ceremony and invite all the veterans that were associated with that unit to come back to the monument dedication. Here's John Batchelder with some Ohio veterans on Culp's Hill in front of the 29th Ohio Infantry, which is, a really interesting monument because it has a spelling error on it. We love that. And then they had ceremonies to dedicate the monuments. This is the 1st Massachusetts Infantry. And this photograph actually comes from an album of photographs, a William Tipton sample album of monument dedications, that it's the Clements Library at the University of Michigan. So we don't have that here. And oftentimes people ask me about photographs of monument dedications, and that's the only place that has a collection of those that I know of. So the Clements Library. Now, some of their stuff they actually digitized, and you can see it on their website, but I don't know if they digitized their, this was digitized for us by Keith Hay, a Michigander. But you can see the speaker's platform, it's really nice. And all the veterans here assembled. Now, one thing I always try to point out to people. So when they have these monument dedications, and these guys are traveling great distances, usually by train to get to Gettysburg, they invite all the survivors. Now, fortunately, there are survivor organizations for each regiment, or there's regimental associations established. So they had contact with all the members of that regiment that were part of that organization. But also, they invite the families of the men who were killed in those units during the war. And also, units are oftentimes from all the same town. Companies are always from the same town. But regiments, sometimes a whole regiment's from one town or county. And so people from that town would also come out. So when you see a picture like this, and William Tipton is taking the photographs of the veterans of the unit, and it looks like a band that's with them, behind the photograph, there could be like 1,000 people. All the people that came along with the veterans and their families, and everyone who came to see the dedication ceremony and listen to the ceremony. Of course, we got, Pennsylvania at Gettysburg, New York at Gettysburg. We got most of the monuments. We have the speeches that were given at the monuments. And it really helps us learn about the battle and the battlefield. Also, we have, as time went on, they came with this idea of putting flank markers that mark the right of the regiment and the left of the regiment, right? I guess over here and left. And so you can see where the veterans think that the end of their line was. And also, you can see which way they think they're facing in the battle. I tell you what, other battlefields that don't have monuments, like I'll say, and Gary, okay, because last time I said this, Gary said, hey, I helped. Gary and I wrote all the wayside exhibits at the Battle of Mine Run. And it's basically in the woods, And so we laid out a trail, we put up wayside exhibits, we had maps drawn, and even if we can figure out where a unit was during the battle, which way were they facing when they were here? these seem like simple things, but we have monuments. Now, we don't always agree with the placement of the monuments and things like that. And there's a lot of arguments among veterans, but it gives us a base of where the units would be. Of course, we also have John Batchelor's isometrical map that was drawn in 1863 that shows us where he thinks the regiments were positioned during the battle. And on Culp's Hill, he has all the regiments on this map. And that's quite an accomplishment. Most maps of the battle go to brigade level and not regimental level. And that's another thing. So I don't know about the other tour guides here, but on my tours, usually at some point, I tell the people, you know, every time you see a monument, there's 300 men. It's a regiment. 5 regiments form a brigade. 3 brigades form a division, and 3 divisions form an Army Corps. That's called the order of battle. And if you remember that, it really helps you understand the battle. And you can stop and you can look at any of the brigade plaques. A brigade plaque on the battlefield will have the general's name on it, the names of the regiments, and whose division they were in, and whose Army Corps. Now, it's a little bit complicated because in the Confederate Army, there are 3 Army Corps. In the Union Army, there's 7 Infantry Corps. So it's a little bit confusing. But you can stop and look at these plaques. And a simple rule, I used to tell my people, although it ends up confusing them at some point. These are put up by the federal government, the War Department, in the early 1900s. And square granite bases are Northern brigades, and rounded granite bases are Confederate brigades or Southern brigades. And it really helps you as you go along. And if you want to read about any of the units, you can by just reading what they have on their plaques. These are not monuments. They weren't dedicated by anyone. They do not commemorate anyone. So in my count, there's only 20 monuments. Of the 1,781, only 20 of them were placed by Southern states. And most of those are more recent. I think when people come here, they generally think they're going to see a whole bunch of Southern monuments, and we simply do not have them. The Northern veterans did not want Southern monuments here and would not allow Southern monuments. So take it for what it's worth. We're talking about mostly Northern monuments. And even the ones to the Southerners, the brigade plaques, for instance, they're put up by the War Department. And again, I would call that a marker and not a monument. Again, but here, one thing does confuse me. Maybe you can always send me an email and explain it. What's the difference between a monument and a memorial? I don't think there is one. But people get into that, you know. It's like people are always telling me this, what's the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? And whatever they say, it is not true. There's a lot of confusion about that. Okay. So also, you probably know in the Northern Army, and I really loved this when I was a kid, that each of the Army Corps has an insignia, moons and diamonds and stars and clovers, kind of like Lucky Charms cereal. And depending on what division you were in, these symbols were worn on your hat. And depending on what division you were in, it was red, white, or blue. 1st, 2nd, or 3rd division. And you can go around the battlefield and you can see the Corps insignias on the various monuments. Like this unit, the 93rd Pennsylvania, was in the 3rd division of the 6th Army Corps. And I don't know, I must have picked that up early on because it's really helpful when you go around and you can see the unit in color, you know what division it were in. That's if you want to go to the trouble of memorizing all the regiments and brigades and divisions. I think I might be exaggerating, but I think I knew all the regiments in the battle when I was in 10th grade. I knew Jim Klaus. He knew them all too when he was young. We used to talk about that. Okay, so let me show you a slideshow here that I put together of my favorite topic to talk about, and that's moved monuments. So I think it was 1883, off the top of my head, the 91st Pennsylvania that served on Little Round Top on the second day of the battle and third day, put up a monument on a prominent rock on Little Round Top. And it's the first monument on the second day's battlefield, I believe, or, down on the southern end of the second day's battlefield. So 1883. It was at the dedication ceremony of this monument that one of the members went to the cemetery and then saw his own grave. You remember that story? Someone else had apparently stolen his knapsack and with his name on it, and that guy was buried in a grave with his name on it. Okay. So Stephen Kelly is his name, if you want to go visit. He's in the first row, next to the road of the Pennsylvania plot. But they dedicated this monument, and then what happened was a bunch of Pennsylvania units dedicated monuments on the battlefield. And basically, the Regimental Association from Philadelphia got together, raised some money themselves, and put up a monument. And then in 1887, the state legislature of Pennsylvania gave $1,500 to every regimental association from the state of Pennsylvania to put up a monument at Gettysburg. But many of these units had already put up a monument. So what they did was they just put up another monument with the money. And in this case, the 91st Pennsylvania put up another monument on that rock and replaced the original monument. And that's the one there today. And you can see it sits back a little bit from that original rock it was on. And then they filled dirt around that rock. Boy, I really like that rock. Isn't that cool? But they kind of filled in around it. And I don't know if you remember, but when I was a kid, there was actually, the park actually had put pavement around the monument. And you could walk out and around the monument on the paved area. It was like a little plaza they put there for visitors. And then they took the original monument and they moved it back slightly, only about 10 yards. And it's on the rock where Weed and Hazlitt were killed. And they actually carved that into the stone. So instead of their regimental monument, it became a secondary monument to mark the spot where Weed and Hazlitt were killed. But you can still go out there and you can still see the rock and you can still see the place where the original 91st Pennsylvania monument stood. So again, homework. And since we're talking about the top of the hill, I just thought I'd throw some slides in here. Little Round Top, by all accounts, was an incredible rocky place. Look at that, before any paths were on it. And early on, they brought some cannons onto Little Round Top. Cannons that do not represent the types of cannons that were at the Battle of Gettysburg. Looks like some kind of naval cannon. And then they carefully placed them on top of these stones up there on top of the hill. And you can see that in subsequent photographs. Do you know when we yell at kids for sitting on the monuments, or the cannons, because they might fall over? Look at that. That does not look safe at all. And you see in a lot of these old photographs, the prop stones, and eventually they put cannonballs on top of the prop stones. But they often put a sack of cannonballs next to a rifled cannon that fired rifled shells. So I don't know if I understand the purpose of any of that. It's more decorative. So there you go. And then eventually they had cannon carriages made. And these are still the inaccurate cannons. But later, when all the cannons were, of course they're all obsolete, they were able to get a bunch of cannons from the War Department and replace the cannons with the original type of cannon carriages. And so while we're talking about Little Round Top, The 155th Pennsylvania on the northern slopes of Little Round Top. We're looking across towards the Altoff farm, often referred to as Wakert because it replaced the Wakert farm. But this monument was placed there in 1886. And then, of course, they had a dedication ceremony. And you can see the veterans of the 155th Pennsylvania on Little Round Top in this ceremony. It's a really nice image. See the Wheatfield Road looking north. Here's another variant of the dedication monument. And again, both of these images are from the University of Michigan. So you get a good view of that. And here's General Longstreet, I believe it is, at Little Round Top and the 155th off to the right. Longstreet and Batchelder look a lot alike in these photographs. About this time, they had the same kind of beard, but there's the 155th. But what happened was they got there, and I believe this photograph here is 1888. They got their appropriation from the state of Pennsylvania, and they decided to put a statue on top of the monument, the Keystone Zouave. So you see that on top of the monument. And, you know, of course, they wore the red hat with a little yellow tassel. They were really tough. And I tell people, I don't know, you know, on your tour what you talk about, but I tell people that after they won the battle, they would wave their yellow tassels at the enemy. Sometimes people don't get that. They're from Pittsburgh. So one other thing is that the road system was different then. And as far as we know, early on, before they even put in roads, people came to Little Round Top. They came up from Cemetery Ridge. They came up the hill, and then a path or a road came out to the 155th. I should have replaced this with I have a much better version of this. And then people got out. People got out right there. And that was their first view from Little Round Top. Wow. And of course, it was from near here that Union artillery was firing into Pickett's charge on the third day. So this was the go-to spot, and everybody stopped, and everybody got their photograph there. Well, you know, this road was really windy, and eventually they tore out that road. And now a very small percentage of our visitors even go down there. In the 70s, when, you know, I was coming here, it was wooded, and that monument was hard to find, and it was vandalized because it was in an out-of-a-way place. I always try to mention to people that, you know, the veterans, when you're putting up a monument, make sure that you put up your monument along the tour route. And make sure that there's a place to park in front of your monument or no one's going to visit it. But in this case, the 155th once enjoyed a bunch of visitation, and, you know, now it doesn't. And what had happened is the road system. You know, the road system was windy on Little Round Top. And today, the parking area is back here. And then you just rode right up onto Little Round Top. And, you know, it went right around. It went back around here where the parking area is. But then it came out and you went right by the 155th. And here's a couple pictures of it so you can see where the road system goes. This is a walking trail to the summit of the hill for the 91st, the 44th New York Castle. But you rode your car right out around in front of the castle. And then the cars went down the hill where the modern parking lot is. But then it came back out, and it went right around near where the 155th is. But because there were nasty turns on the road, those roads were removed. Here's another picture of the road system from Big Round Top Tower. Oh, I have a picture of a vehicle in front of it. And then, you know, today there's a parking area and you can walk over to the 155th, but you don't drive by it like you used to. And so that interests me a lot when I do these Monument Mondays. Also, I like to talk about the changes in the battlefield over the years. And some of those changes are the reason that we have so many moved monuments. So the original 114th Pennsylvania at the Sherfy Farm, the Collis Zouaves. And their monument's pretty nice, but when they got their appropriation, they put a statue of a Zouave on top of the monument. Do you see how I think it's very creative how they kept, on this one, it's a really bad version of it, but there is a peak that goes up to like a pyramid on top of the monument there. But you see how they kept the triangle in their newer version of the monument. And I think that's just fabulous. So they decided that category of monuments, they decided, like the 155th, to just alter their monument with the appropriation and do something a little more exotic. The Bernie Zouaves, the 23rd Pennsylvania, again, from Philadelphia, they originally had a stack of cannonballs on top of their monument. And, you know, their monument was in a different spot. Their monument used to be out along the breastworks out here near the 7th Ohio Infantry. And what happened was the 137th New York decided that they fought at that location. And I think at some point the GBMA came to the decision that, you know what, the 23rd Pennsylvania was in a secondary position and came up in support of General Greene's brigade. So they let General Greene's men have the prominent location along the breastworks. But they actually moved the 23rd Pennsylvania monument to a slightly different location. It's probably only been moved about 20 yards. And then they took when they got their appropriation, they took the stack of cannonballs off the monument and they put the soldier on the monument who is an identified soldier from their regiment in the battle. Martin Spence, I think, off the top of my head. But you can see the stack of cannonballs. You might say to yourself, wow, I'm sure you're not saying that, but what did they do with the stack of cannonballs? And my good friend Mike Warricker, one day, he had permission to go inside the barn at the Butterfield farm. You know, out here along the Carlisle Road on the left, back on the side of Oak Hill, there's a barn. And in it, they have all kinds of leftover monument stuff. And so he took this photograph for me. I specifically asked him if he could see any pieces of monuments in there. And he questions it here, but that's what it is. That's the stack of cannonballs from the 23rd Pennsylvania. So they're also behind the maintenance building on the Tawnytown Road. There's almost like a flank marker graveyard. So you can go back there and see some markers that have been replaced because they were broken or damaged, but there's some markers back there too. Here's the one, when you asked that question, I thought immediately of this. This thing doesn't look very sturdy, and I don't know how it's attached to the base, but that's still out there, and I think that's one that I always, when I see it, I worry that it might fall off or it might tip over, but it's still there in pretty good shape. Now, originally, this monument was up on East Cemetery Hill, and in this photograph, we're looking across the stone wall at the Tour Center parking lot, and right there where the David Studi House is located, that would be the Hoof, Finn, and Fowl today. So the orphanage building is there, behind the trees here. You can't really see the other part of it, but the Charlie Weaver Museum portion of the orphanage building would be like there. And it was here until they got the appropriation from the state of Pennsylvania, and they put up a new monument at that spot. That building is still there at the water supply. It's part of the water supply company for the pond and now the light blue water tower. But you can see where that is today. And then the other one got moved out to Coster Avenue. So they're just marking a different position that unit occupied during the battle. So the monument on Coster Avenue used to be on Cemetery Hill. And in some of our Monuments Mondays videos, if you watch carefully, we'll tell you the exact date they were moved. And sometimes we have articles in the paper that talk about them being moved with stories associated with them. The 99th Pennsylvania Devil's Den. So this is on the very high point at Devil's Den. And of course, one of my favorite units from Philadelphia and Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And they replaced that monument in 1889 with a much more modern looking monument. I often get questions about that. Wow, is that much newer? No, I just think they're making an interesting design with their core insignia, the diamond. And then they moved the original monument to the angle. And so if you go to the fields, a Pickett's Charge, and you can see this monument there today, and it has a red diamond on it, indicating they're part of the 1st Division of the 3rd Army Corps. And then back here, that's like the Biggs, that's where Basil Biggs lived right there, but the Fry Farm during the battle. So this is kind of near the spot where the cyclorama focal point. You can find that easy enough. So near the angle, it's the place where they built a 20-foot platform, and they took those 10 photographs that would later be part of, converted into the cyclorama painting. So if you find that, and then look over to the east a short distance, and you can see this monument. This is the original Knapp's Battery monument that was on Culp's Hill. And when they got their appropriation, they actually moved this monument from the summit of Culp's Hill. And originally, I've seen pictures of it, it was right where the tower is, right on the top of the hill. And then I think they moved it to the side where the monument, modern marker for Knapp's Battery is. And this monument got moved to Powers Hill. Have you climbed up to the top of Powers Hill? Good. Yeah. And this marker up there, at some point, there was I'm assuming a tree fell on it, but it got cracked almost all the way in half, and you can see where they've spliced it back together, really heavily damaged. And of course, Knapp's Battery had part of their battery on Culp's Hill and part of their battery on Powers Hill. So they're marking both locations. And then this is the marker that they then put on Culp's Hill to replace the one that got taken off. And if I remember correctly, I always forget which ones had balls and which ones didn't on top. I think I was missing for years and years, and they put it back out there now. Currently, the Park Service has a person in charge of cleaning and caring and fixing up the monuments if they're damaged. And that's relatively a new thing. So you might see a cleaning crew out there spraying the monuments and cleaning them. So I think probably right now the battlefield monuments look better than they have in a long time. When I was a kid, there was nothing like that. And all the monuments were brown or dark green so they actually have cleaned them in recent years. The original monument to the 149th Pennsylvania, part of the Bucktails, was out near the McPherson Barn on the Chambersburg Pike. And then, of course, they got their appropriation. They put a new monument at that location in front of the McPherson Barn. And the original monument was moved along Cemetery Ridge, and again, that's the Basil Biggs barn back there. It's down across from the U.S. Regular Memorial, south of the clump of trees, but it's the same monument moved. And I think it's just fascinating. And then he added, of course, July 3rd, 1863, pretty sure you can see that that's added. Let's see. Wow. There it says July 1st, 1863. It's real hard to see. I wonder how they did that. It looks like not very well. And that's one thing that's kind of interesting, that there's these subtle things. They'll make subtle changes to the monument when they move it. That's interesting. So here is a really interesting story. So the 121st Pennsylvania had put up a monument on the first day's battlefield, the monument to the right. And of course, again, they're from Philadelphia, Chapman Biddle. And then they built another monument. And for some reason, not all the pieces arrived in time for their dedication ceremony. There was a big block missing, and I don't know if it cracked or what happened, but in the paper, they just say it's unfinished. And you see, these are the accoutrements, the knapsack, the rifle, the hat, and there's like an artillery shell that are going to go on the side of it, but they're missing the block. So they came out anyway, and they dedicated the monument, but it's not there yet. And I think it's interesting because look at the derrick with the pulleys. Can you imagine lifting one of these stones that might weigh like a ton, up, and to get it into position and to lower it down and then attach all the various accoutrements that you have along with it? It must be quite a process. So here's the original monument, and here is the unfinished replacement monument. And then William Tipton, we're fortunate, went out and took a photograph after they got that block, and look, they put that stuff on top. And then you can see it's in front of the Lutheran Seminary building. But then we have two monuments side by side. So then they took apart the old monument and they moved it to the angle, to their third day position along Cemetery Ridge. And again, here's the 106th Pennsylvania monument, the original. It is in the angle in the field out, between Cemetery Ridge and the Emmitsburg Road. And here's another view of it. And believe me, I'm not certain if it wasn't moved more than once, because it just doesn't seem to line up really well. This is from one of my old slides. That's why it's kind of out of focus. But there's the 106th Pennsylvania, part of Webb's brigade. And then in 1889, they replaced it with this really cool monument. Has anybody ever thought about the way they used the drums to mimic the trifoil or the clover, the corps insignia? I think that's really nice on that monument. And then they moved the monument, the 106th, the original monument, out to the Kadoorie House to mark where they were involved in fighting on the second day. And I know I have a lot of these. I could go on and on and on, but I tried to be choosy a little bit. Just to give you an idea. Some units, again, like the 28th, just changed their monument. This one actually was moved. These rocks are no longer there. They moved it back. Today, it would be right along the road when you're driving up Culp's Hill towards the summit. But the 28th Pennsylvania, and they have, you can see the kepi on top, and then here's the monument, how they converted it after they moved it. You see, they took the kepi off the top, put a star on it, and then put some bronze plaques on there, on the front of it. So it's been altered. So, and moved slightly. Now, when I say moved, that one might only be moved like 10, 15 yards. The 139th Pennsylvania, their original monument, they're from Pittsburgh, around there, was on the Wheatfield Road, and just there on the right is the entrance to the Weichert Farm Lane. That's one of the post-war Trossel farm. But you can see it there on that And then they got their appropriation, and they put up a much larger monument at that same spot. And then they put the original monument in the peach orchard, or near the peach orchard. And I think on the back they added a phrase that it was at this location that they recaptured a Union artillery battery on July 3rd in the charge. I don't know how true that is. We argue about things like that. And the 98th Pennsylvania monument was originally placed at the Altoff farm down the Wakert Farm Lane. So Altoff is a farmhouse that was built after the Civil War, and it replaced near the site of a Wakert house that had been there at the time of the battle. The Wakert house wasn't exactly in that same spot, but there's a farm lane that runs down there, and on the evening of the second day, part of the 6th Army Corps, Nevin's Brigade, arrived and charged into that area. So there's the 98th Pennsylvania there along the Wakert Farm Lane. And you can see today it's not there anymore. But there is a monument back there. This would be right here. So there it is back there. And they replaced it with a more modern one. Oh, and also at the University of Michigan, there's this really cool photograph. So they obviously went into the second floor of the Altoff house and took a photograph out the window at the dedication ceremony. I just love that. I knew right away it was from the Altoff house. And then here's the 98th Pennsylvania monument, the replacement monument, when it got their funds from the state of Pennsylvania. And they took the old monument and they moved it up onto Little Round Top, where they actually arrived and made the charge on the second day out across the Valley of Death. The 93rd Pennsylvania, which was part of that same brigade, and I think they're the Lebanon County Regiment. So I think almost the whole regiment's from Lebanon County. And I figured this out when I was a kid. I should say that maybe one of the advantages I always had, when I became a guide, is that I hadn't been studying the battle for like a year or 2 years. I'd been studying it since I was a kid. And I used to come here and I'd bring my photographs and people would laugh at me. And I had this photograph, and it showed that inscription on the rock, and that's carved into the rock, you can tell. And I had not seen anything like that on the battlefield. And so I went to the spot where this monument is, and it sits on top of a rock today, and there's no inscription. But then, as time went by, I pieced together the story that these monuments were placed. Another monument was placed in a spot where they used to be, and then they got moved to a secondary location. So today, this monument is at a secondary location. And I discovered photographs of the 1889, I believe it is. I have to see what the date is. But the monument that replaced it. But this monument is a lot larger and it's a lot heavier, and it wouldn't fit on that rock, so they cut the rock. And you can just see the last part of the inscription on, the part that says July 2nd and 3rd, 1863 is still there. So I'll never forget, it was really wooded, that area then. Today, this area is just open. You can go out there and see what I'm going to show you. It's just open. But at that time, it was all wooded. There were a lot of areas of the battlefield that had grown up and were a lot of briars in there. And this monument was in the middle of woods and briars. And so something caught my attention, and I looked over, and not far away, there are rocks laying with the inscription of that rock on it still. And I learned a lesson, I think, then, that when they do something like this, they don't haul the rocks away. That would be a lot of trouble. They're heavy. They just cut them off and rolled them off, and they're just laying there still near the monument. And I think this is when Gary Edelman and I were hanging out and going around the battlefield, that was one of his favorite things that story about those stones. And I'd have to ask him. He may have been with me the day that I discovered this, or maybe in his tours he discovered it. I'd have to ask him. We've done a lot of things together, so there's no shame in him or me finding something. It is like a challenge though to each other. You know, we are always trying to one up each other. So here's two markers that at one time stood along the Wheatfield Road. And it says on the first one, here fell Jedediah Chapman. The other one says, here fell Henry Merwin. And these monuments were placed, I think, I have it somewhere in my stuff, but I think it's December 1879. These monuments are some of the earliest monuments on the entire battlefield, put up by the 27th Connecticut Infantry survivors. And it marks where their lieutenant colonel and Jedediah Chapman, one of their captains, were killed in the battle. But they don't actually mark the spots of their deaths. And the story is that, no one owns the wheat field. That's privately owned. The park, the GBMA, does not own it. So they don't have permission to put the markers at the spot they actually fell. But in 1882, 3 years later, the park, the GBMA, purchased the wheat field. And then after they purchased the wheat field, these two markers are moved to the location. Now, actually, for some reason, I shouldn't say that, this one was moved all the way across the wheat field to the exact spot. But this one right here, that monument was changed. It was left at that spot, but they pulled the monument up. I don't know if they just recarved it or got a new one, but now it says Jedediah Chapman fell near the center of the field where our regimental monument is. So they took that one away. And I got to tell you, it was Fred Hawthorne who pointed this out to me. The Jedediah Chapman marker was changed. The Strong Vincent marker on Little Round Top that had been placed prior to this, the original monument's in Erie, Pennsylvania, and they changed that out in the 1970s. And the marker for the spot where Charles Frederick Taylor was killed was changed. And so right now, currently, the Jedediah Chapman marker that's on the other side of the wheat field is the oldest monument on the battlefield outside the National Cemetery. And I just had not picked that up. Put there, what did I say? So 1870, it's got to be earlier 1879. Again, forgive me, my memory is not as good as it used to be. But it is older than the second Massachusetts regimental monument. Okay, so I messed the date up there a little bit. So here is the marker for Charles Frederick Taylor, that at one time, the second oldest monument on the entire battlefield. I think in our Devil's Den book, I say it's the oldest monument because outside the cemetery, because this Strong Vincent and this one were placed the same week. And I'd never seen evidence of which one was put there first. And I think Gary convinced me that it's Strong Vincent, and I was wrong. But this one, that's not Wheatfield Road, that's Crawford Avenue, and it was replaced by the modern Crawford Avenue in a slightly different place. But we know where it was because we have several photographs of it. And I've been out there, you can't see anything in the ground indicating where the marker was. But in I don't remember the date off the top of my head, 1904, 1902, they pulled up that marker and they put up a new one to mark closer to the spot where he fell. And it was all because they didn't own that area at the time the marker was put up. Another one that has a similar story you might not think about, here's the original monument to the spot where Alexander Stewart and Joseph Baldwin were killed, and we're on the Hagerstown Pike or West Middle Street, and that's Confederate Avenue off to the right there. And that one, and I do not know the date of this, and we know a lot about Alexander Stewart because that's Henry Stewart's uncle. Henry Stewart, the guy has a bicycle downstairs in our museum. So I was always hoping I could figure out what happened to this stone. but they actually changed this out for a larger, more modern monument that is at that site today. So that's something interesting, isn't it? Monuments that were so altered that the original monument's not there anymore. And then, of course, the wheat field. When they did put a lot of monuments in the wheat field. I think there was one day when I was lining up my postcards, and you probably know from other videos, I'm really into that rock, the rock in the road. And I was lining up a view from this location, and I looked out and something didn't look right. And I noticed that that monument is not at that location today, but it appears in all the photographs and postcards. So I eventually realized that that is the second Delaware monument, and that monument placed in 1885 was originally placed in the wheat field, which again was purchased in 1882. But the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association passed a rule that the monuments have to be in brigade line, which that's my son calling me. He always does that when he knows I can't answer. So this monument was moved to Brook Avenue to be on the regimental line of battle. And the 88th Pennsylvania has a monument on Oak Ridge, and this monument is not the original. The original marker for this unit was placed in 1883. And when they put up their more modern, monument in like 1889, they actually took the marker that was at this location and moved it out into the middle of the field we call Iverson's Pits, and then added on the top of it that this was the site where this regiment captured the flag of the 23rd North Carolina. So they moved it out into the field. But that monument, you see, it says dedicated, erected by the survivors in 1883, August 27th. That is the oldest monument on the entire First Days battlefield. So if you go out there to that site, you can visit that monument. So that's kind of cool because it's old and it's moved. And, here's a photograph from looking from East Cemetery Hill towards Culp's Hill. And in this view, down to the right, you can see the two monuments. And one of them is a 14th Indiana monument. I have no explanation for this. So at some point, maybe when it was first placed there, and I should say, that cannon is not one of the park's cannons. That's an actual cannon that was here for an encampment or something. That's before the War Department had cannons on the battlefield. So I think this image might be from like 1885, but there's the 14th Indiana down the bottom of the hill along Wainwright Avenue. And they moved it to the top of the hill, and it was placed there where Cooper's Battery is. And it's kind of interesting in this photograph. I should have took some modern photographs of it so you could see. But here's their corps insignia, and it says here something like the 14th Indiana, and tells, regiment. And then on the side of it is their principal battles they were in. But what happened was Cooper's Battery went to put up a monument. And of course, they're from Pennsylvania. And they said, you know what? We really wanted our monument right there. I'm curious about this. Really? You couldn't just put it like beside that site? You had to say they had to move their monument? So they moved the 14th Indiana monument to another location on East Cemetery Hill. But what they did is really interesting. They took it apart, and when they're putting it back together, they put the center block in wrong. So instead of talking about the 14th Indiana, that was on this side, it goes like this. Don't you think they should take it apart and put it back together right? And to this day, it's put together wrong. And I'm going to show you one more of those. So Massachusetts. You know what? I think everybody wanted their monument at the high water mark, the place where pickets, charge was repulsed. The clump of trees, the aiming point of Pickett's charge. So Massachusetts, and they put up their monuments early. Here's the 15th Massachusetts, the 19th Massachusetts, and the base for the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, all at the clump of trees. And then all three of them were moved. Here's another image so you can get the idea. The 15th, 19th, and the base for the 20th. And I'm kind of confused. I have this 1888 photograph, and in this one, the 19th Massachusetts is over here, and the 15th Massachusetts is there. And I honestly, did they pick it up and move this one here, and then move this one here? I don't know if you can tell, the 20th Massachusetts is now fully there, the rock, the pudding stone. And then, there's the 100 and there's the 106. So 1888 is probably a good date for this. And there's one of those plaques that's no longer around. That's a monument that's not longer there. But this is moved in like 1889. And eventually, they moved the monuments to different locations, and they put plaques up for those three Massachusetts regiments. But when they moved the 15th Massachusetts, they broke the top section of it. And today, it's not made out of the same stone that it used to be made of. They had to actually replace that. Isn't that interesting? And here's the 12th New Jersey monument. And you can see originally this unit was the monument was at a different location. And it was farther south, closer to the angle. And when this unit decided, I don't know if they had to move the monument, but they decided to make an addition. So they put a center block in it, and they moved it. And of course, on this center block, they have the relief of the Bliss farm now. So they got that. And it wasn't moved that far. Cowan's battery near the angle. They have a really interesting relief on their monument where they're firing into the Confederates. And I think the Confederates are breaking through here. You can't see it really well in that photograph, but there's a Confederate flag. It's one of the few monuments on the battlefield that has Confederate flags on it. Useless trivia. Like, for instance, the Tammany Hall monuments, the only monument with the belly button showing. Things like that. But Cowan's battery, it's interesting that originally on the back of the monument, this was the back of Cowan's monument. And I think one time I tried to read it, in my best copy of it. That's not too bad. But they actually put a bronze plaque over that later. You wonder why you would replace the text with a bronze plaque. Perhaps you said something that someone took issue with, or you gave something and you were bothered that it wasn't correct, or you had a spelling error. The fifth New Hampshire monument has that issue also. They have, this is the one that was made to look like the Corps insignia, the clover, but they got the rocks from different areas of the battlefield. And then they have that centerpiece that has information about the monument on it. But they must not have been pleased with some of the information, or they were, retotaling their losses or something, because now it has bronze plaques around it, probably with slightly different information than it had before. Boy, I don't know why I don't have a better picture of that in there. And then some units wanted their monument adjusted because you couldn't see it that well. The 40th New York is in the Valley of Death, and I'll bet you today there's stuff growing up all around it. So you can't really see it. What did I say? 40th New York, the Mozart Regiment. You can't see it real well. And you can see this is right after it was put up. So they actually had a stone added into the monument later on to make it taller so it wouldn't be covered up by all the weeds. Of course, it has another issue today. Yeah. The least said, the better. And then we have the 16th Michigan that had a similar idea. Their monument is down on the slopes of a little round top below the 44th New York Castle. And the veterans of that unit complained that, weeds were growing up in the summer and you couldn't see the monument. So they moved the monument out onto a prominent rock. And now it's very, very visible. It's one of, I guess my favorite monument placements. But if you go out there for homework, write this down, you can find the original base of the monument still there in place, not far from the monument. But you see how they moved it up onto the rock. And some monuments were moved because they wanted the soldier to face the enemy. And so the monument, like for the Andrew sharpshooters, has been turned. And also that monument, I missed an opportunity to put in a vandalism slide, but the rifle was never completed. So the rifle was never there. But in, I think, 1991, somebody took a baseball bat and hit him in the head and broke his head off. And I have a picture of it without a head. I just forgot to put it in the slideshow. And the park, luckily they didn't steal the head. The head was still there, I believe, and they fixed it and put it back on. So, and then the 78th 102nd Pennsylvania. It's kind of interesting. So here's the road leading from near Spangler Spring up to Culp's Hill behind us. And in this photograph, you can see the 102nd New York there, 78th 102nd. And this, it's actually facing, this is the back of it. Oh, my thing went out. We're looking at the back of it, and it goes down the hill. And, there, I got a better slide of it. See his foot there? And then they decided at some point to move it so it's facing the enemy. So they moved it and turned it, and now he fires down through the woods, through behind the breastworks. And we have a lot of photographs of it here. Here, I think I'm going to show you something interesting. So when they moved it, oh, my thing's gone. They actually spun the center stone around by accident. And so now you see the center stone is actually on the other side. I wonder, can you imagine being on one of these crews? Okay, let's take the monument apart. Then the next day, because they're heavy, it probably takes a long time. Which way did this go on? You can't get out your cell phone and look to see the image you took of it. And so I'm not surprised that, things like that might happen. And then, of course, in 1896, a tree hit this monument and severely damaged it, and they fixed it. And then, this is the 66 Ohio monument that was taken out in that same 1896 storm near the top of Culp's Hill. See the retaining wall from the early road there. But this one was really busted up. And then they put it back together. And then I think in the 1980s, another tree fell on the 66 Ohio and knocked it over. You might remember. And then John Glenn actually helped get Ohio to raise some money to rebuild it in the 1980s. I'm sure Wayne Motch knows the whole story. If being from Ohio, you got to ask him. But then when I was a kid, someone took a hammer to the 78th 102nd. And we don't have much vandalism on our battlefield, but there's a really good case of it, and it was all busted up. But the park fixed it. If you go out there and look at it, you can still see where it was joined back together and where they added some parts that they didn't have creatively. but it actually is fixed. And of course, you know, in one of our Monument Mondays videos, we talk about the lion in the rock there and the story about that. So I'm not going to do that at the moment. The 122nd New York, or 120th New York, 120th, they had put their monument out, and they had their flank markers out, and it made it look like they were in support of the units along the Emmitsburg Road, with their left flank out towards the peach orchard and their right flank up behind the Klingel farm. And they complained about that because that is not how they were positioned during the battle. They were facing off against the Mississippians that broke through the peach orchard and were coming into their position. So they wanted their flank markers moved. And we don't know exactly what happened, but it appears to me that someone decided, instead of moving both flank markers, let's just leave that one there. And so they picked up the right flank marker and they put it out to the left. And so if you go there today and you read the flank markers, it looks like they're facing this way with their backs to the enemy. That must have made the veterans much happier, don't you think? And I enjoy when I read about these discussions and arguments amongst the veterans, because that's how we learn stuff. Okay, a few more things. So here is the road over the bridge at the McPherson's Ridge, or Buford's Ridge railroad cut on the first day's battlefield. And in this view, all of those monuments have been moved because they had to build up the bridge because of the greater height of the locomotives that were needed on that track. So I think the bridge, I did a video on this too, had been replaced like 4 different times and was replaced again recently. So all these monuments along that, 5 or 6 of them off the top of my head, and a few flank markers were moved. Speaking of roads, here's a view from Oak Ridge Tower looking towards the college, and you probably know that today the road is on the other side of those monuments. I'm pretty sure in this case they didn't move the monuments, but the road doesn't go inside the monuments anymore. It loops out around them. And one of them, a flank marker to the 13th Massachusetts out here, actually was moved by the railroad company in the railroad cut controversy. I find that very interesting, that the railroad company dug up a flank marker. The park didn't say anything and just put it in a different location. That was why one of the reasons they're so upset in the railroad cut controversy. So John Burns Monument, and I'm sure I've done this a few times in videos, originally was along Stone Avenue, but they moved Stone Avenue, and when they did, they moved John Burns Monument forward. So that monument's been moved. And we know that by looking at the barn in the background, and of course also because of where the road is. But you know what? When they moved the road on Culp's Hill, they didn't move General Greene's monument. And this kind of upsets me. I think we should move General Greene's monument back and put it on that hill in front of the tower. Because General Greene, not just because I really like General Greene, but because people ride up to the top of Culp's Hill and you park and you see his butt. I don't know if that gives off the aura of respect that we should have for General Greene. So that's a case where they moved the road and didn't move the monument. So the 73rd Ohio used to be up along the Tawnytown Road, but when they widened the Tawnytown Road, they moved that monument down into the annex of the cemetery, so that's in a different location. One of my favorites, the 5th Maine Infantry used to be on Little Round Top. Of course, if you think about the hill and the Wheatfield Road and the hill beyond it, which sometimes people call Munchauer's Knoll, it's still part of Little Round Top. But I guess they put their monument up, and veterans complained that unit was on the other side of the Wheatfield Road, so they moved it north. But you can still go out here. Here I am with some of my friends showing them my discovery years ago. And you can see the rock that monument used to sit on out there. And as far as I know, I'm sure the veterans knew that was moved, but I started pointing it out in the 1990s. And here, Mike Warker found this one for me. You can see Gibbs Battery, and you can see the 5th Maine Infantry. So you get an idea from that of where we're talking about that monument used to be on Little Round Top. So there's all kinds of reasons monuments are moved. Arguments among veterans, roads being put in the battlefield, a new state appropriation which allowed them to move the monument. The 8th Ohio is an example of what you were just talking about. The top of the statue is made out of white bronze, and right away there was an issue with it. So they removed that and put that bronze drum on top of the monument today. And that's the one that sits at the old Home Sweet Home site. And here's the 4th Ohio. And like I said, when I was a kid, that monument started to lean over. I think it had, they said, an 11% it got to lean before they took the whole top of it off and had it in park storage for many years, until the state of Ohio got some money, put a big steel beam in the center of it, and they put it back up with a crane. And then a couple odd stories here at the end. The 149th New York, they put up a monument on the battlefield. And the veterans showed up at the dedication, which I think it was in 1887. And the veterans look at the monument, and they decided to have a meeting. They all got together, and they rejected the monument. And I think I have the exact words at their meeting, what they said here. On assembling, the structure presented was so far from the compliance with the specifications of the contract, the veterans refused to accept it and called upon the New York Commission for its rejection. So they rejected it. Now, we're really fortunate because William Tipton, the photographer, he would go out a few days before the dedication, he would unveil the monument, and he would take a photograph of it. And then the day of dedication, he was standing in a crowd with stereo views and cabinet cards for sale of your newly dedicated monument. And he would sell them to the veterans. And then, of course, he would take a photograph of veterans in front of the monument, and he would sell them that too. He was really good at this. Well, so because of that, he had a photograph of the monument before it was rejected. And so that's the original monument, nowhere on the battlefield today. We have one letter where it was taken to the Bushman Quarry. And we have people that speculate that it could still be laying around somewhere. But I know Dave Levan. I've been back there on this property. I don't think we can find it. If I do, I'll have a Monuments Monday on it. We're going out there again, not too long from now, to look for it or to look around. I don't know if we're going to find anything. So this is the monument they replaced it with a few years later. So what was that? In 1887, I think it was. Oh, no, 1889, they rejected it. And then this one was placed in 1892. So they replaced it. And another little mystery, I have more photographs of it than this. Do you see down to the right by the pond, there's a base for a monument? And it appears for a few years at that location in different photographs. I have no idea what monument that was supposed to be. That was going to be at that location, and they put a base, and then it was never placed. So I guess we could guess it was one and just got moved a little bit, but who knows? You know, in 1883, the Gettysburg Water Company put a pond in there, and that really divided Cemetery Hill from the town and allowed that area to become more commercialized. And then I guess I was going to just point out here that you see the stake leaning against the rock. John Batchelder had hundreds of wooden stakes around the battlefield with numbers telling us where things happen. But they were made out of wood, and none of those stakes are there today. And we argue when looking at his list about where things happened on his list. And I mentioned in the beginning, Colonel John Wheeler, killed in action, July 2nd, 1863, painted on a rock. How many places like that were there? Would you consider that a monument? That's interesting. And then we have monuments that once were there, like the original post for the U.S. regular Army, that are no longer there. Massachusetts had secondary position markers. We already saw one of them earlier. Here is an image taken by one of my friends of the, I think it's kind of hard to read here. I think this one's the 22nd Massachusetts on Little Round Top. And I know where that is. I know where that was because that rock's still there. You know, you can kind of see, it's not the best photo, but you can see where it was. See the rock. And one day, I was going to look in my notes to see the date. I think I did a video on this. You have to look at the video. But one day, I'm going to guess it was in the early 2000s, maybe it's like 2008. Gary and I are out on the battlefield. And I was showing Gary this photograph, and I was showing him this rock. And he said, why don't we look around to see if it's still there? I'm like, what? And so he looks under a crevice in a rock, and Gary pulls out the marker to the 22nd Massachusetts Infantry. Someone had broken it off and just jammed it between rocks. Who knows how long ago? Well, that photograph, though, a friend of mine took that in the 70s. So, and this is, I think we're somewhere in the 2000s. I wrote a whole article about this. And so what do we do? So first, we put it back, and I was like, Gary, you know, man, I have some friends at a relic shop in town. I wonder how much people would pay for an actual monument from the battlefield. We could sell it. Those things do go through your mind, you know. And so Gary and I decided we'd put it back. We hid it back. And then we got Scott Hartwig and Winona Peterson, the park historian and the park collections manager, archives at that time, I guess. And we brought them out there and we unveiled it and had some photographs taken. And then, of course, we requested that the park put the marker back up. And, of course, they promised that when they rehabilitate Little Round Top next time, they'll put the marker back out. It is not there. So, but it's fascinating that, you know, do you guys know the story that, and the guy contacted me, so I know, but he had one of these magnets. You ever see these people that throw a magnet into the river and then just pull the rope? And he was at Sachs Bridge, and he was thrown off the bridge, and he pulled up a marker for Excelsior Field, like one of those metal park markers. Like somebody had vandalized it, and then I guess threw it off the bridge to get rid of it years ago. We don't even know when. There's no record of when this might have happened or when that was replaced. When I was a kid, they found the arm of the 11th Massachusetts Infantry outside the main gate leading into Fort Ritchie. And somebody then returned it to us, and the arm was put back on. And then, of course, I'm sure you know this story. At Big Round Top, there was a relief of Farnsworth Charge, a bronze relief. And a kid went to a junkyard in Frederick and said, hey, I have this thing. It came out of my garage. Could you buy it for scrap metal? So the guy bought it and then called the park and said, I think I have a piece of one of your monuments that some kid, I got his name, sold to us. And that's how they got that back, because it was missing for a while. And that Farnsworth Charge marker is in the park. It's in the museum today, in the last gallery of the museum, and a replacement is put onto the monument. Okay, so I think I talked long enough. So thanks everybody for listening to my Monuments Monday Live.